Studying history doesn't mean merely arranging events in chronological order. It means developing an understanding of the impact of societal forces on organizations. Studying history is a way to achieve strategic thinking, see the big picture, and improve conceptual skills. This course illustrates the evolution of significant management perspectives over time. The timeline reflects the dominant time period for each approach, but elements of each are still used in organizations today. Management practices and perspectives vary in response to social, political, and economic changes in larger society. Let's first look at management approaches that focus primarily on production and efficiency, the things of production. Later, we'll examine management approaches that focus on human needs, the humanity of production. Remember this: managers are always on the lookout for new techniques and approaches to meet shifting organizational needs. Looking at history gives managers a broader perspective for interpreting and responding to current opportunities and problems. And finally, management and organizations are shaped by forces in larger society. The classical perspective of management takes a rational, scientific approach to management and seeks to turn organizations into efficient operating machines. The practice of management can be traced to 3000 BC, to the first government organizations developed by Sumerians and Egyptians, but the formal study of management is relatively recent. The early study of management as we know it today with what is now called the classical perspective. The classical perspective on management, with a primary focus on the things of production, emerged during the 19th and early 20th centuries. The factory system that began to appear in the 1800s posed challenges that earlier organizations had not encountered. Problems arose in tooling the plants, organizing managerial structure, training employees, scheduling complex manufacturing operations, and dealing with increased labor dissatisfaction and resulting strikes. The classical perspective contains 4 subfields, each with a slightly different emphasis: scientific management, bureaucratic organizations, administrative principles, and management science. Scientific management emphasizes scientifically determined changes in management practice as the solution to improving labor productivity. In the late 1800s, Frederick Winslow Taylor became known as the father of scientific management. He proposed that workers could be retooled like machines, their physical and mental gears recalibrated for better productivity. Improving productivity meant that management itself would have to change, and further, that the manner of change could be determined only by scientific study. Scientific management is considered one of the most significant innovations influencing modern management. The bureaucratic organizations approach emphasizes management on an impersonal, rational basis. Max Weber introduced elements such as clearly defined authority and responsibility, formal record-keeping, and separation of management and ownership. During the late 1800s, many European organizations managed on a personal, family-like basis. Employees were loyal to a single individual rather than an organization or its mission. The dysfunctional consequence of this management practice was that resources were used to realize individual desires rather than organizational goals. Employees in effect owned the organization and used resources for their own gain rather than to serve customers. Weber envisioned organizations that would be managed on an impersonal, rational basis. This form of organization was called bureaucracy. The administrative principles approach focuses on the total organization rather than the individual worker and delineates the management functions of planning, organizing, commanding, coordinating, and controlling. Henry Fayol and Charles Clinton Spaulding were major contributors to the administrative principles approach. Fayol outlined 14 general principles of management, several of which are part of management philosophy today. Another, more recent management approach that falls within the classical perspective is management science. Management science uses mathematics, statistical techniques, and computer technology to facilitate management decision-making, particularly for complex problems. Management science became popular based on its successful application in solving military problems during World War II. 3 subsets of management science are operations research, operations management, and information technology. Moving on to the humanistic perspective, which emphasizes understanding human behavior, needs, and attitudes in the workplace. The humanistic perspective on management, with a primary focus on humanity of production, emphasizes the importance of understanding human behaviors, needs, and attitudes in the workplace, as well as social interactions and group processes. There are three primary subfields based on the humanistic perspective: the human relations movement, the human resource perspective, and the behavioral sciences approach. The human relations movement was based on the idea that truly effective control comes from within the individual rather than from strict control. The school of thought recognized and directly responded to social pressures for enlightened treatment of employees. The early work in industrial psychology and personnel selection received little attention because of the prominence of scientific management. Then a series of studies at Chicago Electric Company, which became known as the HAWTHORNE studies, changed all of that. The HAWTHORNE studies were a series of research efforts that were important in shaping ideas concerning how managers should treat workers. In the late 1920s, managers at Hawthorne Works, a large manufacturer operating in Illinois, asked themselves this question: are our employees more productive in a well-lit environment than they are in a poorly lit environment? To answer their question, managers at Hawthorne Works hired some consultants and commissioned a study. Their findings were probably what you'd expect. Well-lit lighting increased productivity, as did few other variables, such as having a clean workstation, allowing employees to build and work in their own teams, and having regular breaks. Well, these were the direct findings of the Hawthorne studies. None of them were groundbreaking. But researchers made another observation, one that led to an idea taught in nearly every business textbook used in the last 70 years. The conclusion was that changes in the work environment could impact productivity, but those gains are only short-term. Like any good researcher would, those working with Hawthorne Works scratched their heads and asked why. The answer became known as the Hawthorne effect, and it's the same principle that leads most of us to slow down when we see a cop on the road. Like a speeder reacting to seeing a cop, the participants of the Hawthorne Works study changed their behavior because they were receiving attention. But once the attention was gone, they reverted to their normal behavior. The human resource perspective maintained an interest in worker participation and considerable leadership, but shifted the emphasis to considering the daily tasks that people perform. The human resource perspective combines perspectives from job design and job tasks with theories of motivation. In the human resource view, jobs should be designed so that tasks are not perceived as dehumanizing or demeaning, but instead allow workers to use their full potential. Two of the best-known contributors to the human resource perspective were Abraham Maslow and Douglas McGregor. In the mid-1900s, Douglas McGregor became frustrated with the early simplistic human relations notions while president of Antioch College in Ohio. He challenged both the classical perspective and the early human relations assumptions about human behavior. Based on his experiences as a manager and a consultant, his training as a psychologist, McGregor formalized Theory X and Theory Y. The assumptions of Theory X include: the average human being has an inherent dislike of work and will avoid it if all possible. And because of that dislike of work, most people need to be coerced, controlled, directed, or threatened with punishment to get them to put forth adequate effort towards achievement of organizational objectives. Finally, the average human being prefers to be directed, wishes to avoid responsibility, and has relatively little ambition and wants security above all else. The opposite assumptions of Theory Y include: the expenditure of physical or mental effort in work is natural as play or rest. The average human being does not inherently dislike work. External control and the threat of punishment are not the only means for bringing about effort towards organizational objectives. A person will exercise self-direction and self-control in the service of objectives in which he or she is committed. The average human being learns under proper conditions not only to accept but seek responsibility. And finally, the capacity to exercise a relatively high degree of imagination Ingenuity and creativity in the solution of organizational problems is widely, not narrowly, distributed in the population. The behavioral sciences approach draws from psychology, sociology, and other social sciences to develop theories about human behavior and interaction in an organizational setting. One specific set of management techniques based on the behavioral sciences approach is organizational development, known as OD. OD evolved as a field to improve organizations' health and effectiveness through its ability to cope with change, improve internal relationships, and increase problem-solving capabilities. The techniques and concepts of OD have since broadened and expanded to address the increasing complexity of an organization and its environment, and OD is still a vital approach for many managers. Among the management approaches we discussed in this presentation, the humanistic perspective has been the strongest from the 1950s until today. Renowned management thinker Peter Drucker emphasized that the organization is a social and human institution. Drucker revived interest in his call for managers to involve and respect employees.